This is the European edition of Breaking Banks, the world's #1 fintech podcast and radio show. We bring you the European unicorns, startups, founders, regulators, and leaders innovating the rapidly evolving fintech scene today. A truly localized podcast with both English and local language content, with some of the world's most well-known hosts and influencers in the fintech sector globally. Join us every week as we explore what makes the European Union a phenomenal proving ground for many of the fastest growing fintech plays in the world today. Okay, let's roll.
Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of Breaking Banks Europe. I'm Francesca Aliverti and as usual, I'm going to be your host for today's episode, which is going to be quite interesting actually because it's a sneak peek of one very nice event that is going to happen in Zurich in the coming June, precisely from the 26th and the 28th of June. And I'm talking about the Point Zero Forum. So for the ones that are not really familiar with the event, we are gonna give you a full overview of what to expect. But of course, also the rest of you that have already quite some knowledge of Point Zero Forum will discover, I'm sure, new things and in general, what these guys are cooking up for us to make us enjoying also this new edition of the event. And for the ones of you that are joining us through video, you also can see that, as usual, I'm not alone. So let me introduce you my guest for today. Very happy to have here Pat Patel, the Executive Director at Elevandi. Hello, Pat. Really nice to have you here.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
And also Christoph Baumann, the Envoy for Sustainable Finance at the State Secretariat for International Finance in Switzerland. Hello, Christoph. Really nice to have you here.
Hi, Francesca. Great to be here. Thanks.
And you have also the longest job title ever. You know that. So we start very well. All right. Welcome, guys. And thanks a lot for joining us. So as I was saying before, the aim of this episode is to give our audience a sort of sneak peek of what is going to happen during the Point Zero Forum in Zurich. So I would really like to start from the basics and ask you, Pat, to go first and tell us what Point Zero Forum is and what do you expect to get out of this event.
Thank you. And there's lots of events around the world, lots of fintech gatherings, quite heavily commercial in nature. But when we were thinking about Point Zero, we wanted to create something different. And so we looked across multiple markets. We looked about, what is the need in the industry right now? And everything started to coalesce around the requirement for policymaking and technologists to come together. And so that is the heart and soul of what Point Zero is. It's a policy tech dialogue. And, a lot of people ask me, okay, that makes a lot of sense, but do you have any more kind of proof points in why this is a need? And one of the things I frequently say is, if you think about the Web 2 movement in and around kind of 2006, 7 and 8, when it started to come through, the Web 2 movement was the fruits of three foundational technologies coming together. And so that was mobile, social, and cloud. And so when those three kind of technologies, foundational changes came together, that's when you had organizations such as Airbnb, Uber, a whole wave of kind of social media companies come along. And as that sector kind of grew, it kind of went on its own without really any input from policymakers or regulators or governments in the early years. And so as we're beginning to see right now, we're seeing some challenges emerging, particularly with that Web 2 kind of movement. And so from our perspective, there is a big need as the world embarks upon a Web 3 world, and we're probably in and around the Web 2.5 space now. There is a strong need for policymakers and regulators and governments to be closer to some of these changes that are happening. And so when we started to think about Point Zero, we started to think that there is a strong need for a policy tech dialogue, in particular around digital assets being one, artificial intelligence, but also any other technologies that start to come down the line. And that's how we see the future of and you know, the event that's coming up as being really important to bring policymakers, regulators together, to bring technologists and corporate leaders so there can be an active dialogue. And so the focus for this year is obviously around digital assets, and in particular around institutional digital assets. Then we have a piece around the applications of artificial intelligence. Everyone's heard, you know, the hype around generative AI. I don't think it's going away. There is a lot more movement happening, even though there seems like a little bit of a lull right now. But, you know, we're excited to say that there'll be a number of kind of governments announcing projects during the Point Zero Forum. And so these will be public-private sector projects which seek to kind of bridge that gap and look to see, well, how can we develop these technologies in a responsible and effective manner? And then, you know, for us, it's very important to cover sustainability. And for us, it's around, you know, how can we leverage technology to solve some of the challenges we're seeing around sustainability, and particularly around a low carbon future. So that's kind of the framing in terms of a content perspective. And last year it was our inaugural Point Zero Forum. And, you know, I'm a little bit biased, but it went fantastically well, and it brought the right people together. But importantly, there was the right dialogue. So you have your main stage content, but you also have these roundtables that are kind of 2 hours in length, and you have the right experts discussing and debating specific topic areas, and they lead to kind of white papers, focus groups, but also help shape potentially, you know, policy-making choices. And so, you know, there is a key bit here is that by bringing public and private sectors together, you know, there's two things that we want to achieve from this. You know, one is the public sector to really think about some of the policy choices that are going to happen over the 1 to 3 year time horizon. But then also conversely, on the private sector side, you know, to hopefully shape some of the product and strategic choices on particular, you know, services that are looking to be delivered. And if you have that kind of bridge between the public and private sector, you can kind of create new opportunities that are in sync with both parties. And so that's how we feel that it's a unique offering in the marketplace. And to my knowledge, there's very few of these types of activities in Europe, certainly, but probably the rest of the world. So we're quite kind of proud about having this unique positioning for 4.0 Forum. And we're super excited about, you know, what's going to be delivered. And clearly I'll share a bit more later.
Yeah, definitely. And you mentioned the bridge between the public and the private sector. And as you said, it's not very frequent to see this kind of bridge tackled into an event, especially because many times you have events talking just for the sake of talk. I can say that. So it's really like... in this case, I experience also quite a deep dive into specific problems and specific solutions, which is not something that we can see around a lot. So it's definitely going to be interesting to see also this edition of the forum. Christoph, we said that this is an event that comes out of the collaboration between Elevandi, of course, but also the State Secretariat for International Finance. So could you tell us how this collaboration started and why Zurich, and why do you think this kind of event is it's going to be so crucial for your community?
Thanks a lot. So a lot of what I wanted to say is actually already covered as eloquently by Pat. As mentioned by him, we did the first iteration last year, and it was really, to us, a crucial endeavor or goal to bring these various stakeholders together. And it's not as intuitive as it seems. I mean, as one might think, because you have a room where you have central bank governors, you have heads of regulators, you have CEOs of financial institutions, and then you have the CEOs of the startups in the same room.
Cookies, I would say.
And that's just it seems very random, but it makes complete sense, because especially in these topics Pat mentioned, such as digital assets, AI, and sustainable finance, sustainable fintech, so much regulatory movement is going on, so much dynamics is going on. So it's really key to have the policymakers be informed by the technology firms, but as well as the technology firms being informed with what the dynamics are on the policy side. And it's been such a fruitful endeavor last year that it's just key for us to continue with this. And I must say, I was really so positively surprised last year by this closed setting, because it's really, you walk through the rooms and each person you meet is highly relevant C-level type of person, and just makes every discussion you have meaningful and relevant to your personal work. And I see this as a policymaker. I had fantastic discussions especially with various fintechs. But I also see it for fintechs, and I think for fintech as well, it's a great opportunity to also get in touch with the capital side, which especially in the current market environment is much more challenging as a couple of years before. So it's also a great opportunity on that side, I would say. It's really a unique combination, which I believe, especially for these three topics, the three priorities we set this year again, is absolutely crucial.
Great, thank you.
Sorry to steal your thunder, Christoph, in my first answer there. But just, sorry, Francesca, just to echo that, I think, one of the beautiful things was serendipity, and that you could have, a governor from a central bank, you could have a corporate CEO from a large institution, you could have a founder and an investor all having a conversation. And so there was a particular place at the Point Zero Forum where it was kind of the main walkway where there were so many interesting conversations. And one of the things I like to do, and by the way, I'm not a big fan of events, even though I'm involved in a lot of events. One of the most beautiful things was kind of walking around and just overhearing, just kind of sensing what the vibe is, the types of conversations that were happening. And that's the thing that I find that is really inspiring, to get different people from all walks of life coming together to have an interesting discussion or a debate. And it wasn't just from Europe. We had quite a big audience from Asia come across, as well as the US. And then you get that cross-pollination of views and opinions, and that's where the magic really, really happens. So I just wanted to kind of echo that, Christoph, because I think it's a really important point, especially with such a small audience, because, we cap it deliberately at 1,000 people.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is we feel that for 1,000 people, you can have that serendipity, you can have those conversations, you can seek out individuals that you want to kind of either pitch to or even just connect with. And that's what I think is the real magic of the Point Zero Forum.
And if I may just jump on that as well, apologies for that. As somebody who's annually at the climate conferences, which around the negotiation part resemble more and more a trade fair, I wanted to echo what Pat said also. I think that's one of the key benefits of the Point Zero Forum. It's not a trade fair. It's very action-oriented. So you have both we try that both the events are as action-oriented as they can be, and the panel discussions, the roundtables and the workshops, but also these bilateral meetings. And it's you basically see just the hallway, the central hallway is just the entire day packed. And that's just a very, very good sign that we got the right audience into the room.
Yeah, definitely. Also because at the end of the day, these people are actually the one that could make the change happen. So it's important that they cross-contaminate each other also, because if you think about regulation, it's really like specific on topics and countries specifically. And it's important. I think that they are going to be able to cross-contaminate each other and understand a different perspective that they are living in the different countries. So Pat, you mentioned quite some interesting topics that you are going to cover during the event, topics that are actually quite hype right now, and also that brings with them quite some problems. So you also mentioned the AI. So I'm Italian, and as you probably know, we have the ChatGPT banned for privacy reasons. So it's also all these interesting topics that comes with innovation, comes also with regulatory problematics and so on. So could you give us a general overview of these three main pillars that you are gonna discuss during the forum? So you mentioned, if I'm not wrong, digital assets, sustainability, and AI. And maybe if you could give our audience your overview from your experience of what you are seeing this trend going and where are you seeing this trend going, and maybe also some innovation that you are seeing, particularly working right now in these fields.
Oh, cheers. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, one of the topics we introduced quite recently was around governance and risk management, because what we've seen this year in particular is a number of companies that have struggled to manage risk, to manage their governance. And so this was a recent addition in addition to the topics, and I'll come on to those. But we feel that there are a number of businesses around the world of all shapes and sizes that are operating risk management frameworks that were fit for purpose yesterday and the day before yesterday, but not necessarily in sync with today and tomorrow and the day after. And so there'll be a number of conversations specifically focused around what does an effective risk management kind of framework look like in today's world? How does it keep you kind of resilient for tomorrow and the day after? And so we see that as being a part of an individual kind of series of conversations. So that will flow through some of the main stage, some of the workshops, but also some of the roundtables that we're running. But my sense is it will kind of flow through into most areas of the dialogue that we'll start to see. And so that's kind of something that's quite important to cover. And I think there is an important piece between the public and the private sectors coming together on that. In particular, the private sector is starting to drive this because it has such, a big implication. The second area, the second piece is around the technologies that we're looking to cover. And for us, we thought long and hard with our colleagues at SIF, how should we be framing artificial intelligence? Should we be covering generative AI? What strands of this? Is such a nebulous topic area. And so what we're doing this year is trying to ground it in the here and now, with one eye on, a year to 2 years down the line, but the focus is on the here and now, and so practical applications. So you'll see a number of companies, unfortunately, they're making announcements, so I can't actually share what they're going to
yes,
be
of course,
talking
yeah.
about.
I would never ask you.
Well, they'll come looking for me. I think they'll probably listen to this conversation right now, so I'll keep it quiet. But yeah, so there'll be a number of organisations, largely from kind of the smaller guys, talking about propositions that are tangible, that can solve some of the back office challenges that banks, potentially financial institutions, but the broader industry are kind of looking to solve, but also that channel to the customer. And that's more around the generative AI piece. And so we'll see good examples of that. The second area is digital assets, which clearly has gone through an extremely tough kind of 12 months. And so the bit that we're focusing here is going to be quite heavily on stablecoins and CBDCs. But also there is a debate that's been emerging for a little while now between tokenized deposits and stablecoins, and how should that net out? So there'll be a lot of conversations there, and I think the important part, as I keep kind of referring to, is a public-private dialogue there, and I think that's going to be quite an interesting one. And then amongst all of the challenges that the world's seeing, we can't leave sustainability. It can't be the second or the third or the fourth priority, because a lot of businesses are evaluating things slightly differently now than they were a few years ago. And so, we're going to keep pushing the narrative and what's required to solve some of the challenges we're seeing on sustainability. And Christoph will be able to share a little bit more about that. But in particular is, how do we leverage the technologies and the tools that we currently have? And so there is a suite of sessions that I really like that we've put together, where we're looking at the nexus between a few topics and technologies. So the nexus between digital assets and sustainability, the nexus between kind of digital assets and AI, and then clearly the nexus between AI and sustainability. So it starts to couple these together, because if we start to use these technologies, maybe we can start to move from proxy data to real world data, and that would start to be quite a bit of a game changer. So that's kind of one thing I want to kind of say. And then the last piece, without monopolizing this podcast, is what makes us quite different is the fact that a number of central banks and governments will be talking about the projects that they're working on. And I think this is where it kind of sets Point Zero apart from other activities. And so, the MAS is working closely with the Japan kind of Financial Services Authority. And so they'll be leading a series of discussions, in particular roundtables around a project called Project Guardian. And that's focused quite heavily around tokenization of real world assets and decentralized finance. Then we have the BIS and the Bank of England leading a topic around Project Meridian, which is around the coordination of settlements and central bank money. We also have the Swiss National Bank and the Bank of France and the BIS leading a discussion around the infamous kind of Project Mariana. And so that's kind of around, a cross-border exchange of Swiss francs, euros, and Singapore dollars. So that's kind of, more anchored around wholesale CBDCs. And then we have, a number of other projects that will be released. So you'll have to kind of stay tuned as they start to kind of get announced. And when I say released, it's more sharing an update of what's going on and how the industry can really get behind this as well. So that's something I'm really stoked about. And I think there's going to be a lot of value with the public sector sharing and being open and sharing, some of these interesting projects that hopefully will have the opportunity to change the way financial services is currently delivered today.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Pat. And you mentioned quite a lot of interesting sessions and quite a rich program. So I'm sure we're in the next weeks we are also going to see much more coming. And following this fil rouge of the topics that Pat was explaining us, I would like to focus a little bit more on the sustainability side, because as Pat, you were saying before, it's a sort of cross topic, let's say, because it shouldn't be only one theme, but be more connected also with all the other technology sessions, for example. And I also see quite an interesting push coming from, for example, from the consumers in having what we call the sustainable finance projects. Christoph, you are the expert here on this field. So I would like you to give our audience an overview of how sustainable finance has developed during this year, and what we can expect in the coming years.
Absolutely, very happy to. And I want to conclude with the message that sustainable finance or sustainable fintech is now a dominant part of sustainable finance, and for multiple reasons. So you would have, especially when it comes to climate and nature, you have huge pushes over the last year to promote disclosures of corporates. So to make data more readily available from corporates, but also from the natural habitats, so that it can be leveraged for sustainability services towards corporates, again, towards financial institutions. And this quality of these data sets are becoming better and better over time. And they're becoming better on the one hand because of sustainable fintechs and tech companies assessing the satellite imagery, assessing remote imagery, and making sense of all that data with machine learning, with AI, to really process that huge amount of data from corporates and beyond to really build their services. On the other hand, this availability of data is just a perfect ground for fintechs, for startups itself to build their services upon, and to then sell these services towards corporates or financial institutions that now more and more have regulatory demands, and to comply with these regulatory demands. So I think the fintechs, they have a role on both sides, both to make the data available more easily and at the same time to use the data that's available to produce services used by corporates and financial institutions. So it's becoming data, and the processing of data is becoming a central part of sustainable finance, which naturally makes sustainable fintech become a central part of sustainable finance as well. I think that is going to be the focus as well from at this year's Point Zero Forum. We, for instance, have one main stage event where it's all about the availability of climate data globally, how we can get current projects that are on the way, both in Asia and globally and in Europe. How can we connect them, make these data sets openly available without IP, free of charge, to really let innovation do its role, which is absolutely key for achieving the net zero transition in this case. So this is one of the central events we have at the Point Zero Forum, where we will also make various announcements around this event.
Nice, great to hear. And so you both mentioned some roundtables going on and other formats, and I'm quite familiar also with some Elevandi special sessions. One being also CMPD, so the Capital Meets Policy Dialogue, and I think it's interesting for our audience, Pat, also to double click a little bit on this, because I think it's something that it's not so common to see around in events. So I would like, if you'd like, of course, you to explain us what CMPD is, and give us a little bit of an overview of what do you expect to cover in that session.
No, it's a very good question, and the genesis of this is in the early years in Singapore, so between 2016, when the festival, in particular the Singapore FinTech Festival, started. So between 2016 and 2018, 2019, we used to run a lot of matchmaking activities between investors of all shapes and sizes and startups. And then over time, it became very apparent that the investors knew all of the startups. There was no need for any matchmaking. There was no need for any catalyst. And so we started to think long and hard about, what do we do next? And so we spoke to a number of investors, so family offices, VCs, sovereign wealth funds, LPs, and we started to really understand the needs. And, one thing that came across, resoundingly was that, there was a strong desire and need to understand different policy roadmaps in different jurisdictions. And so if investors understand what that 1 to 3 years, 3 to 5 year policy roadmap starts to look like, and what's in the minds of some of these policymakers and regulators, then that would inform their investment thesis, which in turn would inform the capital deployment choices that they're likely to make over the coming years. And so that's the genesis of the Capital Meets Policy Dialogue. We ran the first one in Singapore last year to a huge success. And so we felt that this is something we could start to roll out across different jurisdictions and bring different voices together from the policy and regulatory side, but also from the investor side. And this year, we're super excited to have it quite heavily focused around Europe. There will be a global nuance to it, but it will be quite heavily anchored around Europe, and will bring together a room full of investors. As I mentioned, family offices. There will be sovereign wealth funds there. There'll also be VCs and LPs, and then there'll be quite a few policymakers and regulators, because conversely, they want to understand what investors are thinking as well. Because if we're going to move forward, certainly with sustainability, there's going to be a strong requirement for some of these organizations to help fund that transition. And so there will be an interesting dynamic going on. We'll be covering tech elements, but also sustainability related. And we have a few big names that are going to be coming in, probably one of the most highest profile CEOs, unfortunately, from a financial institution. I can't talk about it right now, but as soon as it's announced, I'm going to tag you and Breaking Banks in the LinkedIn post. I need to make sure that we can square it away from the powers that be at the moment, so we can share that. And then we have a number of regulators. So Adriana Harris is going to be there, so one of the highest profile regulators from the US, in particular on the digital asset side. And then we have a number of panels as well. So it's quite a short program, but what it will do is frame what's going on from the public sector side, the private sector side, and then there'll be some networking and opportunities for both communities to meet. So it's quite kind of targeted at that investor policymaker kind of segment.
Yeah, and it's a great link, I think, because what many people always forget is that access to capital, of course, comes from the private sector, from all the VC and so on, but has to be linked with policymakers and all things and regulation side of the matter. Definitely. So thanks a lot for another great, I'm sure, CMPD. We are going to queue for a very short break, and we will be back in less than 1 minute.
The FTS Group builds innovation ecosystems. We engage incumbents, investors, entrepreneurs, technology partners, and regulators to build trusted and connected fintech tribes around the world. We firmly believe that innovation in financial services will truly improve people's lives. Learn more on ftsgroup.eu.
And we are back at Breaking Banks Europe together with Pat and Christoph, talking about Point Zero Forum in Zurich, which again is going to be held at the end of June, 26th to 28th of June in Zurich, as I said. So one thing that we were discussing before were all these different formats that are going to be covered during the event. And one of the things that I was also familiar with, and I know that they are of incredible value, are the roundtables that you are organizing, guys. And one of them particularly caught my attention, and I would really like to ask you, Christoph, to double click a little bit on that. And it's the one called the Green FinTech Ecosystem. Could you tell us a little bit, what do you exactly mean with this term, and which role are FinTech companies playing when we talk about green FinTech indeed?
Thanks a lot. So the green fintech ecosystem is an idea we came up with 2 or 3 years ago, and identifying the need to really get to know all the relevant stakeholders that make a green fintech flourish from the start, or even before the start, getting the university students and other potential founders interested in the field of green fintech, knowing what potential use cases there are, then getting the incubators interested in the topic of green fintech, getting the VCs ready and have a competence on that, getting the universities to research, focus on that, and obviously the financial institutions as potential customers of these fintechs or the wider public. So what we did is over the years really bring these key stakeholders together as part of a network founded by the Swiss State Secretariat for International Finance. And this roundtable really reflects these network members where we really discuss what are the various use cases green fintechs have, be it, as mentioned, to make data readily available, be it to help satisfy regulatory demands, be it on the rating side of things. So there are various use cases which we really want to delve into, and we want to have an actionable discussion of what is the role, what can the various stakeholders do to make the life of green fintechs easier. So on the one hand, what can I as a state, what can we as policymakers do to improve the business environment, the framework conditions? One concrete example I can give you is that in the recent regulation to make climate disclosures mandatory across the economy, we made sure to demand a reporting in electronic harmonized format, such as XBRL, because we know that green fintechs then have much easier time to use that data and to process that data. So it's really making sure that the various stakeholders that have a certain lever, that they know about the needs from green fintechs, so that they can really take this into account when they do their actual work, in my case, the policy work. And that's the main use case of this roundtable, is really to create this awareness and to find ways how each of us can really still improve on ourselves.
Great. Yeah, it's definitely going to be an interesting one. Pat, I would like now a little bit to zoom out from the conference for 1 second, because we touch upon a lot of different topics that are quite hot right now. And I know that you have quite a extensive experience working in different geographies. So as we know now, you are running Elevandi, which is based in Singapore, and it's kind of an extension of the Monetary Authority of Singapore. That we can definitely define one of the best in class when we talk about a flourish fintech ecosystem. But you have also worked quite a lot in Europe. I actually met you the first time when you were the mind behind the content of another great event in Europe. So I would like to use, let's say, your privileged position and knowing so many different geographies and the innovation in so many different geography to understand your point of view on two things. So one, which are the differentiator factors that you have seen in the different places you have worked in, and which are, in your opinion, the key factors that make an ecosystem a successful one, as, for example, the Singapore one?
Sure, no, it's a very good question. And every time I hear extensive experience, all I hear is old.
No way.
So thankfully, I'm not as old as Matteo.
For sure, that always remember that.
And he has a lot of extensive experience, and then maybe we'll leave it as that. So yeah, a very fortunate position, a very privileged position to have seen fintech grow. If you think fintech as a term, I'm not a big fan of the word. It's a media term that grew out in kind of 2010, 2011, 2012, in and around that time, as a result of the financial crisis. And having seen the phenomenon that is fintech and seen how it's grown in Europe and parts of the US, Singapore was a little bit later to the game. It started to really start off in 2016, 2017. And I think, when I look at Europe and I look at kind of, if you look at what's happened in the US and Asia, in the US, it's kind of just grown organically. It's just kind of developed opportunistically, which is good. In London, they've tried to be quite more careful and planned about things. But what I've seen in Singapore is a long-term plan. And so that started off in 2015 to where we are today. You could still see resemblance of this 5 to 10 year plan that was in place then, still being used today, that consistency. I think there has to be a desire and a hunger as well from all parts of the ecosystem. So it's all well and good, government and policymakers and regulators having that desire and hunger, but you need to have an alignment with the universities, as Christoph's mentioned really recently. But universities, the different parts of that private sector, I think is really important. So whether it's kind of startups, whether it's kind of investors, whether it's kind of corporates and their innovation labs, and then kind of thinking that, what is the focal point? Because for Singapore in particular, it was never going to be a B2C play. It was always going to be a B2B play. Yep. And so what Singapore's done very well is kind of double down and be very focused and clear about the spaces that they wanted to occupy, and taking the kind of refreshing approach that fintech isn't looking to attack banks or institutions, but looking to collaborate with. And that's the positioning that Singapore's always taken. I think the other element to this is, working with what your advantages are as a country. And so, Singapore is a tiny country, but what it has going for it in terms of its advantage is it's a hub across Southeast Asia for other industry verticals. And so what we've seen over time is that organizations will look to move to Singapore, and they may not have a great deal of business in Singapore, but they use it as a beachhead into Southeast Asia, into South Asia, so India. And so that's where, Singapore's done really well is kind of been having a focused strategy, a desire, an ambition that's kind of long-term and consistent, and then making sure you have champions across the ecosystem. And one small, but I think very important example is there was a WhatsApp group, and it's a small thing, but it's kind of developed over time. There was a WhatsApp group set up in 2016 called FinTech Chopal. And what that did is bring policymakers, regulators together with the industry. And so throughout since 2016, it's the most active WhatsApp group I think I've ever seen in my entire life, because every day there is news items that are shared and then also dissected from different people's vantage points, whether you're an investor, whether you're a founder, whether you're a policymaker. And then you get a debate and a discussion going. If someone's looking for support, they can also reach out in that group as well. And as it's gone along from 2016 to where it is today, you've got some really senior people. You've got kind of leaders of banking institutions from across the whole of Asia in this WhatsApp group. You have fintech founders that are based in multiple jurisdictions in the world. And then you also have regulators and policymakers from different jurisdictions as well. And so it's a real good mesh of individuals, thoughts, ideas, but also a support and help group. And that, I think, has played a key role where it's supported and championed a number of projects, a number of initiatives, but also it's kind of signifies a movement that started way back in 2016 in Singapore.
Yeah, definitely. And of course, kudos to the ones that are putting these different players all together, because it's definitely someone built up that WhatsApp group and make it flourish. So it's definitely... champions from all over the ecosystem. Very interesting, Pat. Thank you for sharing this. And Christoph, so we have talked about also with Pat about all the policymakers and regulators that we are gonna see during the forum. And building up on my question to Pat, I also want to understand your point of view on the different elements that make an ecosystem growing, because also Switzerland and Zurich in particular, it's quite an interesting example of a very focus-driven and strategy-driven ecosystem. And perhaps you can give us also a point of view on the role of regulators and policymakers in driving innovation. What's your experience with that?
Absolutely, very happy to. And I do think Singapore and Switzerland share quite a number of commonalities in this. And for instance, especially the tiny market. So it just doesn't make sense or it's much more difficult to start a B2C company with a Swiss focus than this to do a B2B. At the same time, we're coupled with the issue, especially on the development side, of very, very high salaries. So it's a struggle, I would say, as a startup to get the people in-house located in Switzerland, the development teams, etc. On the other hand, I think we've been one of the leaders in innovation of the last couple of decades, and that's just the quality of university graduates that the market has is just astonishing. So the innovation is a key factor, and the research is a key factor, I believe, to us compensating or overcompensating these deficiencies. The other certain advantage we have is we're in the middle of Europe. So while we are not part of the single market directly, the distance to European countries is very small. So we see very frequently that Swiss companies actually start in the European market, although they're based in Switzerland. So that obviously makes things more easy, coupled with us having one of the largest financial centers in the world. So a fintech that gears towards financial institutions has a quite competitive advantage when they're based in Switzerland, because they basically can walk down one or two streets in Zurich and Geneva, and they capture some of the major players in the world, and that's absolutely key, I would say. Now, what can a policymaker do? And I think policymakers in Switzerland, we try to stay as technology neutral as we can in everything we do. But we also want to ensure that there's legal certainty in what the companies do. And one example, I think, which has been hugely successful is the introduction of blockchain law in Switzerland. I think a world first, where you just ensured that the companies have, the blockchain companies specifically, have legal certainty of what transaction would be legally upheld in court, what's a security and whatnot. And it's quite done on a technology neutral way. And that drove innovation in that particular field massively. And the other thing I mentioned already before, then any work we do on the policy side when introducing new regulation have startups in mind, be it when it comes to disclosures to make it electronically available. Things like this, just this general awareness. You don't need to particularly regulate something for startups. You need to have startups in mind whatever regulation you're doing.
Great. Yeah, this is quite crucial element that many other countries don't take into account, I have to say. So guys, we are almost at the end of this episode. So I really have one very last question for you both. First to Pat, I know you cannot share too many things, but I have to ask you some names, at least a couple of names or companies that you can share with us.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the forum will be opened by the Federal Councillor in Switzerland and the Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore. So that's kind of the opening for the forum. We are also very fortunate to have Sergio Motti. So he's probably one of the highest profile CEOs at the moment. And so he will be at the forum. We also have the CEO of Swiss Re, so Christian will be there as well. We have a few kind of leaders from the US as well. So I mentioned already Adrian Harris, but we also have Roman Regelman. So he leads the Bank of New York Mellon's kind of securities and digital assets business. And then there is a whole host of regulators from probably every kind of jurisdiction within Europe. So we'll see, the Bank of England, the Bank of France, the Bank of Italia, the Bundesbank will be there, as well as kind of their counterparts at senior levels across Asia. And then we have and there's too many to say here, but a whole raft of kind of founders and investors and all of those that are interested within the artificial intelligence space, within digital assets. And then we have some of the leaders that are providing kind of interesting propositions around sustainability as well. So it will kind of be a nice melting pot, as Christoph mentioned earlier in this conversation, of individuals from across the ecosystem, but framed around those that are interested in AI, digital assets, sustainability, and that's the core piece around the 0.0 forum.
Yeah, definitely. If you look at the speakers page of your website, it's like quite impressive. So, and I know more are coming. So it's definitely quite the place to be, I would say. Christoph, also a last question to you. As we said, you are the envoy for sustainable finance at the State Secretariat for International Finance. And I would like you to share maybe some initiatives you are currently working on and you're focusing on.
So I would say that the most exciting initiative we're currently working on is actually going to be on the main stage then at 0.0 Forum as well, with Mary Shapiro from GFANS and from Bloomberg joining. And it's this net zero data public utility. So a global platform accessible to all without IP, free of charge, of all the key climate data needed for corporates and for financial institutions to build their transition plans, and for NGOs and others to assess whether a transition plan is credible or not, and the progress along the transition plan. That's an absolutely central platform, as my boss calls it, the best invention since sliced bread. And I think it's really key to get all the key jurisdictions, such as Singapore, Switzerland, France, UK, US, and other European countries on board to support this platform. We see a huge traction there, and to get all the key financial institutions to take part as use of this platform. So expect a big push at the 0.0 Forum, but also looking ahead at COP28, so the climate conference in Abu Dhabi and Dubai. There we see then the launch of the platform.
Great, guys. Thanks a lot for joining us. And I really look forward to meet you at the 0.0 Forum in Zurich. And I also advise all our audience to have a look at the website, look at everything that they are preparing for us, and register to the event, definitely. Thank you so much, guys. Thanks, Pat. Thanks, Christoph. And thanks to our audience for having tuned in. Remember to follow Breaking Banks on all streaming platforms, and of course, all our social media platforms as well. I'm Francesca Aliverti, and see you next week. Ciao.
Thanks for listening to Breaking Banks Europe, a Provoke Media podcast in cooperation with FinTech Stage. Don't forget to tweet us out, shout out, or post to the team at Breaking Banks EU on Twitter. If there's something or someone you'd like to hear on our cast, let us know. See you next week on Breaking Banks Europe.